3.5 miles down in the Philippine Sea, cameras descend through absolute darkness until something emerges that shouldn't exist anymore. The twisted remains of a heavy cruiser that carried the weapon that would end World War II. But here's what makes your blood run cold. This ship didn't sink from enemy fire during combat. It sank after completing the most important secret mission in naval history. And what happened to the 900 men aboard in the 4 days before rescue would become the worst maritime disaster in U.S. Navy history. July 30th, 1945. The USS Indianapolis slips beneath the waves at 12:14 a.m. 900 men hit the water that night. Only 316 would be pulled out alive. But it's not the sinking that haunts the survivors. It's what came after. 4 days floating in the Pacific, watching their brothers disappear one by one. Sharks, dehydration, hallucinations, and the Navy didn't even know they were missing. This wasn't just a shipwreck. This was a cover-up that reached the highest levels of American military command, a captain court-martialed for crimes he didn't commit, and a search for answers that wouldn't end until August 2017, when Microsoft billionaire Paul Allen finally found what the ocean had been hiding for 72 years. The evidence was down there all along, and what they discovered would vindicate a dead man and expose one of the Navy's darkest secrets. The USS Indianapolis was built in 1931, a Portland-class heavy cruiser that earned 10 battle stars by 1945. But on July 16, 1945, she became something else entirely, the most important ship in the American fleet. At 8:30 a.m., the Indianapolis departed San Francisco with cargo that only a handful of people aboard knew anything about. 2 Army officers guarded a large wooden crate lashed to the deck. Another canister was locked in the flag lieutenant's cabin under armed guard 24 hours a day. The crew was told it was important. They were told not to ask questions. What they weren't told was that they were carrying enriched uranium-235 and components for Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would obliterate Hiroshima. The mission brief was explicit. Deliver the cargo to Tinian Island as fast as humanly possible. The Indianapolis made the 5,000-mile journey in just 10 days, arriving at Tinian on July 26, 1945. Mission accomplished. But the crew was given no shore leave, no rest. Instead, Captain Charles McVay III received new orders: proceed to Guam, then continue to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines for training exercises. Here's where the story gets dark. During the briefing at Guam, Captain McVay asked about the submarine threat along his route. He was told the route was routine, and no specific threat existed. This was a lie. Naval intelligence knew that Japanese submarine I-58 was actively hunting in the Philippine Sea along the exact route the Indianapolis would take. But there's something worse. The Indianapolis was not provided with a destroyer escort. When McVay requested one, he was told none were available. Another lie. After delivering the atomic bomb components, the Indianapolis became expendable. The mission was complete. The ship and its crew were no longer strategically important. So when Captain McVay asked about submarine threats, he was given the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug. The Indianapolis departed Guam on July 28, 1945, sailing alone into waters where the Navy knew enemy submarines were hunting. This single administrative decision would condemn 880 men to death. July 30th, 1945, 12:05 a.m. The Pacific is calm, the night is clear, and the USS Indianapolis is making 17 knots. Everything is normal. Everything is fine. And then the ocean explodes. Commander Hashimoto, aboard I-58, had been tracking the Indianapolis for an hour. At 12:02 a.m., he fires 6 torpedoes from just 1,500 yards. 2 torpedoes strike home. The first hits the starboard side, tearing a 40-foot hole in the hull. Thousands of gallons of fuel ignite instantly. The second torpedo hits beneath the bridge. The explosion destroys the forward fire room and obliterates the communication systems. No distress signal. No SOS. Nothing. Within 3 minutes, the Indianapolis was listing 10 degrees. The forward section was flooding. Fires were raging. Captain McVay, thrown across the bridge by the impact, gave the order to abandon ship at 12:08 a.m. But the internal communication system was destroyed. The order never reached most of the crew below decks. Men in the engineering spaces continued fighting to save the ship, not knowing the captain had ordered them to abandon. The Indianapolis sank in 12 minutes. 12 minutes from torpedo impact to final plunge. Hundreds of men were still trapped inside when she went down. 900 men hit the water. Most had no life jackets. Few made it to life rafts, and none of them understood that the worst was yet to come, because the torpedoes didn't kill most of the crew. The 4 days that followed would claim far more lives. Here's the part that makes your blood boil. When the Indianapolis sank, she didn't send a distress signal, but naval protocol required ships to report their arrival at ports. When a ship failed to arrive on schedule, search and rescue was supposed to begin immediately. The Indianapolis was due at Lake Gulf on July 31st at 11 a.m. When she didn't arrive, someone should have noticed. But no one did. Not at Leyte, not at Guam, not at Pearl Harbor. For 4 days, 900 men floated in the ocean, and not a single person in the United States Navy realized they were missing. At Leyte Gulf, the port director assumed the ship had been delayed or rerouted. At Guam, no one was tracking her because she'd been classified as a routine movement. At Pearl Harbor, the Indianapolis had been removed from the tracking board after completing her atomic bomb mission. Just another cruiser. Not important. Not worth watching. And here's the truly infuriating part: 3 separate radio stations actually received distress signals from the Indianapolis in those first minutes after the attack. One watch officer thought it was a Japanese trick. Another decided the signal was too weak to be genuine. The third didn't want to wake his commanding officer in the middle of the night for what might be a false alarm. All 3 dismissed the signals. So 900 men were floating in the Pacific, and no one was coming to save them, because no one knew they needed saving. First light, on July 30th, revealed the true horror. The survivors were scattered across miles of ocean. Most had no food, no water, no protection from the tropical sun, and floating all around them, drawn by blood from the wounded, were hundreds of oceanic white-tip sharks. The oceanic white-tip is one of the most dangerous sharks in the world, for exactly this situation. They're aggressive, fearless, and they feed on disaster. Schools of them began circling at dawn, and by mid-morning, the attacks had begun. The sharks didn't attack in a frenzy. It was methodical. They would circle, select the weakest, then strike. The wounded man would scream, thrash, attract more sharks. Within minutes, he'd be pulled under. But the sharks weren't the only killers. Dehydration and exposure claimed lives just as fast. The tropical sun during the day raised body temperatures to dangerous levels. The men had no fresh water, and drinking seawater only accelerated dehydration. At night, hypothermia set in. Men who survived the day would die in their sleep. And then came the hallucinations. After 48 hours without water, the brain starts to malfunction. Survivors reported seeing the Indianapolis floating just below the surface, fully intact. Men would dive down, trying to get back to their ship, and never come back up. Others saw rescue ships on the horizon, and swam away from their groups, disappearing into the Pacific. By the end of the second day, nearly 200 men had died. By the third day, the number had climbed past 400, and still, no rescue was coming. The survivors who kept their sanity focused on small tasks. One group organized into a human chain, linking arms so sleeping men wouldn't drift away. Another designated swimmers as shark watchers to drive away circling predators. Some sang songs, others recited prayers, but holding on became harder with each passing hour. Edgar Harrell, a Marine private aboard the Indianapolis, later described those days as beyond human endurance. He watched more than half his group die. He fought off sharks. He held men as they died. He sang hymns to stay awake because falling asleep might mean never waking up. And through it all, he kept wondering why no one was coming. On August 2nd, 1945, at 10:25 a.m., Navy pilot Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn was flying routine anti-submarine patrol when he noticed an oil slick. He descended to investigate. What he found would haunt him forever. Hundreds of men in the water, most barely alive, scattered across miles of ocean, some waving frantically, others floating face down, already dead, and circling all around them. Sharks. Gwynn immediately radioed for help and began dropping life rafts. Within hours, every available ship and aircraft was converging on the coordinates. But even with rescue underway, men were still dying. Some died waiting, their bodies finally giving out after 108 hours in the water. Others died of shock after being pulled from the ocean. When rescue ended on August 4th, the numbers told a story of catastrophic bureaucratic failure. Of approximately 1,196 men aboard, when she left Guam, only 316 survived. 880 men died. About 300 went down with the ship. The other 580 died in the water over 4 days, because no one realized they were missing. But here's where the Navy's real crime begins. Instead of investigating why their systems had failed so catastrophically, they found a scapegoat. They chose Captain Charles McVay III. On December 3, 1945, Captain McVay was court-martialed on 2 charges, failing to order his ship to zigzag, which might have made it harder for the submarine to target them, and hazarding his ship by failing to order abandoned ship in a timely manner. The first charge was absurd because Navy orders gave captains discretion about zigzagging at night. The second charge was a lie because McVay had ordered abandoned ship within 3 minutes of the torpedo strikes. But what made the court-martial truly obscene was this. The Navy flew Commander Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander who had sunk the Indianapolis, to Washington to testify. Hashimoto told the court that zigzagging would have made no difference. He'd had the Indianapolis in his sights for over an hour. He could have sunk her regardless. The court ignored this testimony and convicted McVay anyway. McVay was the first captain in U.S. Navy history to be court-martialed for losing his ship in combat. The message was clear. The Navy needed someone to blame, and the dead men couldn't defend themselves. McVay received hundreds of hate letters from families of lost sailors, people who'd been told by the Navy that their sons died because their captain failed them. McVay bore this burden for decades, but it never stopped eating at him. On November 6, 1968, at age 70, Charles McVay III took his own life. The survivors spent decades fighting to clear his name. They wrote letters. They lobbied Congress. They told anyone who would listen that their captain had done everything possible to save them. In October 2000, 55 years after the court-martial, Congress finally passed a resolution exonerating Captain McVay. President Clinton signed it into law. But McVay was 32 years dead by then. And through all of this, there was one piece of evidence that could have settled everything. One piece of proof that would show exactly what happened, and whether Captain McVay or the Navy was responsible. That evidence was sitting 3.5 miles down in the Philippine Sea, and it would stay there for 72 years. August 19, 2017. The research vessel RV Petrel, owned by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, deployed its autonomous underwater vehicle into the Philippine Sea. Finding the Indianapolis was considered nearly impossible. The coordinates were approximate. The ocean floor reaches 18,000 feet. The wreck could have drifted, broken apart completely, or been buried under sediment. But on August 19th, the sonar showed something that shouldn't be there. Something large and metallic, sitting upright on the seafloor at 18,000 feet. The AUV moved closer. High-resolution cameras descended, and there was no doubt. They'd found her. The USS Indianapolis was sitting on the ocean floor in remarkably good condition. The bow section was intact. The bridge structure was recognizable. Gun turrets were still in place, and most remarkably, you could still see the ship's bell with the ship's name clearly visible. The discovery made international headlines. But what the wreck revealed was more important than just closure. It was evidence. The damage to the ship's hull told a story buried for 72 years. The torpedo strikes were exactly where Captain McVay reported them. The flooding pattern confirmed the ship had taken catastrophic damage that would have sunk her regardless of any actions the captain could have taken. The speed of the sinking proved that the 12-minute timeline was accurate and that any delay in ordering abandoned ship would have been irrelevant. The wreck proved what survivors had been saying for 7 decades. Captain McVay did everything right. The Indianapolis was doomed the moment those torpedoes struck, and the only crimes committed that week in July 1945 were the Navy's decisions to send the ship without escort, to classify her movement as routine, and to fail to notice when she disappeared. Edgar Harrell, the Marine who'd survived 4 days of sharks and dehydration, was 91 years old when the wreck was found. He told reporters that seeing the footage brought back memories he'd spent 72 years trying to forget. But he also said, "Now maybe people will understand what we went through. Now maybe they'll understand that it wasn't our captain's fault. It was the Navy's fault for forgetting about us." 3.5 miles down in the Philippine Sea, the USS Indianapolis continues her eternal patrol. The 880 men who died because of bureaucratic failure have their memorial now preserved in the crushing darkness, where no one can disturb them. The ship that carried the atomic bomb, that helped end World War II, that became the Navy's worst disaster and biggest cover-up, finally has her story told correctly. And Captain Charles McVay III, dead for nearly 50 years when his ship was found, finally got the vindication he deserved. The ocean kept the evidence safe until the truth could be revealed. Sometimes that's all we can ask for. Sometimes the deep has to remember when the living choose to forget. The last survivor of the USS Indianapolis, Harold Bray, died on September 21, 2023, at age 101. He was the final living link to those 4 days in the Pacific. With his death, all the survivors have joined their shipmates, but their ship remains, sitting upright on the ocean floor, a permanent reminder of what happens when bureaucracy values procedures over people, when institutions protect themselves instead of the men who serve them, and when the Navy forgets that every ship on their tracking board represents real lives depending on them to remember. The Indianapolis delivered the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb ended the war, but 880 men paid the price for that mission, and for 72 years, no one could prove whether their deaths were honorable sacrifices or preventable tragedies. Now we know. The wreck doesn't lie, and 3.5 miles down, the truth waits for anyone brave enough to descend into the darkness and face it.